My name is Ashley Hurst. I'm an artist and an art teacher. In today's video tutorial, we're going to make a drawing of a beautiful hummingbird. I plan to use gray Mi-Teintes paper and also Prismacolor Premier pencils. In a moment, we'll take a look at exactly what colors I'm going to be using. But if you don't have the same colors or the exact same paper, don't worry about it. Just use what you have. You can find a reference photo, a link to a reference photo in the description below this video. You might want to use that on a separate screen or go ahead and print it out for your own reference. It'll make it a little bit easier to follow along. Even though this is a colored pencil tutorial, I do plan to use a little bit of gouache paint at the very end of our process. Gouache is an interesting paint. It's sometimes called opaque watercolor, and it actually dries to a matte finish. So you can use it to add small highlights over a colored pencil drawing, and you almost can't tell it's even there. I also plan on using a fine-tipped ink pen, like a Sakura pen. I'll actually be using Molotov pens, just for a few really small details in the feathers of our hummingbird. Let's go ahead and switch over to the overhead camera and get started. Let's begin by finding the head. Consider where it falls in the picture plane in terms of how far it is from the top edge and from the right edge. It's a little bit just to the right of center and also above center. I want to go ahead and find the beak and then start on the body. We'll go ahead and rough in a body in the general shape that we see. Sure, there'll probably be some mistakes in there that need adjusting, but we have to get something down before we can make any adjustments. Like with the head, consider the tip or the tail and where it falls in the picture plane compared to the edges of our composition. Incidentally, this paper is 8 by 10 inches plus the border, so the paper was 9 by 11. All right, the head is 1/4 of the body we can see there on the left, so we'll measure the head with our pencil and then make sure that 4 heads would fall between the top of the head and the bottom of the tail. Make any adjustments necessary. Now let's compare the full height of the bird to the width of the bird, both through the wing and the chest, and also from the tip of the wing to the beak. All of those measurements are about the same. The bird is slightly wider than it is tall, so I'm going to go ahead and stretch out my wing a little bit more. And what we're doing there is checking proportion. One part compared to another part, like the height compared to the width, or before that, the head compared to the full height. Now that I'm satisfied with the proportion of the bird, how its parts compare to one another in terms of size, I can go ahead and find a detail like the eye. You don't want to put any details in until you feel pretty good about the proportion, in case you have to change those things. I'll use what I've drawn so far to help me place the feet. This foot that I am working on right now is pretty much straight down from the left edge of the head. It looks like I've drawn the wing a bit too low. The wing's the right length, it's the right shape, but it's in the wrong place by a small margin. So I'll go ahead and start drawing or redrawing the wing before erasing the original wing. That way I can compare my new wing's shape to the first one that I had drawn. Don't be afraid to get your eraser out and make changes when you see you've made a mistake. It's the changes that make our drawing more accurate. All right, I feel a lot better about the placement of the wing now. So I had to draw the wing twice, but that's okay. Let's take a look at the colors that I've selected: carmine red, processed red, pale vermilion, pink, true green, olive green, spring green, jade green, indigo blue, light cerulean blue, cloud blue, lilac, black, 50% cool gray, 20% cool gray, and white. If you don't have those exact colors, just use what you have. Before beginning with the colored pencil, I want to remove any excess graphite from the drawing. I'll use a kneaded eraser. You can use any eraser for that. And go ahead and start with the lightest lights. In this case, of course, I'll be using white and be looking for any areas in our bird that appear to be white, pure white. So we've got a little bit of white on the top of the wing and the bottom inside edge of some of the feathers closest to the body. A little bit around the neck. You want to make sure you get these whites in place early because it's difficult to go over a darker color with a lighter color. And so if the white's not in place and you hit this area with another pencil, you'll never get it back. Looks like a little bit of white around the eye as well. And there's some really dark areas too, even black. But I'm going to go ahead and start with an olive green, a pretty dark green, just to try to find some of these black areas, some of these black shapes. Remember, we can go over a color with a darker color when using colored pencil pretty well. So by putting some green down where the black will eventually be, it'll still look black, but there'll be a little bit more of a warmth to the black. It won't feel so flat and so cold. So the wings appear to me to have black in them, but also green anyway. And that's why I chose green to use where I believe we'll probably use some black in just a little bit. So I've done a little bit of shading in the tips with olive green. And there's more green across these feathers, but we'll come back to the green. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the darker half of the body and lay in a little bit of 50% cool gray. I'm not pressing down as hard as I can with the pencil because I want to be able to get other colors in the pattern over top of this area. But it is in shadow and that makes the area rather dull. So I'll start with some gray there and back to some white for a few little accent feathers. Once you find the combination of colors that you're going to use in an area, it's just a matter of repeating those colors over and over in layers, gradually adding more pressure until you achieve the value that you're observing in the reference. This pencil is the 20% cool gray. It's pretty light, not quite as light as white. And I'm using it to go ahead and find some of the whiter areas in the lighter half of the bird's body. These are white feathers, but they're not showing up as pure white. So the 20% cool gray should do the trick. Remember, if we don't get some of these lighter areas in early, we may lose them when we start using darker pencils. Now, the beak is black, but its highlight appears to be blue. And so I'm using the cerulean. Now, I believe this is the cloud blue on the top half, using the cloud blue. Bouncing around, I've added the white highlight in the eye. And if you look closely at the reference, there's just a little bit of purple there. I used the lilac pencil before going ahead and filling in the rest of the eye with black. Very high contrast, that small dot of white and light purple just above the black. The bottom of the beak is very dark. I'll actually use the indigo blue in the bottom of the beak and maybe a little bit of black too. And there is this small little line of black feathers, or apparently black feathers, that reach or stretch out from the eye to the beak. Okay, so there's the indigo blue on the bottom half. So the beak, in essence, is blue, a very light blue on the top half, where the light is hitting most directly, and then a dark blue for the shadow. And I'm going to keep that dark blue going, the indigo blue, and just go ahead and use that to find the edge of the right half of our bird's head. And there's some dark accents along the bottom edge of those bright, bright feathers that define the head from the body. Be sure to keep checking the reference, getting into the pattern of the bird's feathers. It's kind of speckled or spotted, and they're not exactly blue, but I think I can make a pretty good approximation of the color if there's some blue in those speckled feathers. I want to bounce back and forth and see how these colors kind of play against one another. So before continuing with the bird's body, I'll go ahead and start with some oranges and reds in the head as well. I'm going to be using the vermilion, where the red in the head feels warmer. And maybe some pink, where the color becomes a little bit cooler. And also the processed red, which is more of a red-violet. It's still pretty cool, a cool red-violet. All of these colors are close together on the color wheel, but they do change a little bit in value and in temperature. Now, there are a few feathers that are really picking up the light, really bright highlights. And again, I need to get some white in there before I continue with the reds so that we don't lose these whites. We won't be able to go back and put bright white on top of another color. So in color pencil, you kind of want to work from light to dark, lighter values and lighter colors to the darker values and colors. So I'll go ahead and work around some of those whiter feathers, those whiter marks, with the processed red. Then I can work on top of those with white and create a lighter version of those colors that will still not compete in terms of value with the brightest whites, because there's already a darker color underneath. Okay, so I think adding olive green on top of the indigo blue is a good color combination for the pattern or the speckly feathers in the shadow of our bird. And if those two colors work together, I'll continue using them all the way down the body of the hummingbird. It really doesn't matter which one I put down first. I can put the olive green down and then hit it with some indigo, or put the indigo down first and hit it with olive green. As long as my pressure isn't too strong with the first color, I'll be able to mix the second color into it. That seems like it's going to work, so I'm going to bounce back to the head and really do some drawing, some fine line drawing with the black pencil, trying to discover some separation between the feathers, the fine feathers of the hummingbird's head. Now, the hummingbird's head has shading on it, and I can't forget about that. But I want to go ahead and put some of that pattern in first. We can always shade over it. We've switched to some darker pencils now in the head. Remember, we started with white. We added the reds in, which are darker than white. And now I'm working with the black and the indigo pencil, which are darker still. Working from lighter pencils to darker pencils. In some areas, it requires a very light touch with the darker pencil, just to add some shading. It's okay if the shading obscures some of the pattern. That's what happens in a shadow. We really don't pick out the details as well. But those feathers, having been delineated to begin with before the shading, they're still somewhat separated. The head's looking pretty well developed now, so The body needs to be brought up to the same level of rendering, the same level of completion. Be sure to keep checking your reference. This pattern is variable. There's areas where the speckly feathers are larger or smaller or close together or further apart. And the answer to that is in your reference. You want to look at your reference at least half of the time that you're drawing. All right, so the pattern on the shadowy side of our bird is almost complete using the indigo blue, and we'll go back to that. We'll add some green in there. We'll shade over it a little bit to mute those feathers a little bit to bring that pattern together. But I want to go ahead and add a little bit of our bright green. I believe this is the spring green, in between some of the 20% cool gray in the lighter half of our bird's body, and start to really bring that side of our bird together. Start to fill up the page. There's always going to be a little bit of the gray of the paper showing through. And if you're not working on gray paper, that's fine. You could work on white paper or blue paper. The color of your paper will impart a little bit of mood and tone to your bird. So if your bird is not on the same Strathmore gray paper that I'm using, it might look a little bit different than mine. It won't be wrong. It'll just be a little bit different. Now there is a very light edge, white even, around the tail feathers of our hummingbird. That's going to be important. It's going to separate the bird better from the background than would the other colors in the tail. And you can see this white in the reference. It's not going down on top of a color, but around a color. So it still appears white. So the head's pretty well developed and the body's far enough along. I think it's time to work more on our wing. And remember, the colors in our wing, we're using white, maybe the 20% cool gray at times, the olive green, and the black. And we'll bounce between all of those pencils, building up the coverage on our paper until we've reached the value and the colors that we see in the reference. There's the olive green making appearance again, and we'll just bounce back and forth between these four colors that seem to be represented in varying ratios throughout the wing. Adding some black over the green, more at the tips. And the wings are starting to feel a little too neutral. I think I need to go back to the green pencil for a bit. Remember, the green is darker than the white or the gray, so it will cover it pretty well out towards the middle of the wings. Compare the values in the wings to the values in the bird's body. Make sure you're dark enough in that way. And speaking of darkness, we'll go ahead and use our black pencil and do a little bit of shading over the shadow half of our bird's body. And shading across this pattern will help bring it together a little bit in addition to darkening it. Light pressure with the black. Be careful. In the tail, the black is quite a bit stronger, so we can start to add more pressure as we build up the layers in the tail. And some of those green feathers near the bottom of the bird's body are pretty dark. They could use a little bit of black over them as well. Again, a combination of colors. Color pencils is about mixing. It's about stacking layers on top of one another, gradually adding pressure with each layer until you've burnished the paper pretty well and built up a solid application of wax. And the feet are very high contrast, and I had put some white marks in for where the light hits the most prominent foot. Adding some black in the rest of that shape will really bring that foot out. I haven't really used the jade green much. It's a cool green. It's almost like a grayish green. And I think I need to add a little bit of that where the lighter half of the body on the left kind of meets the wing. And any other places where I may want to dull out the spring green that had been applied earlier. That jade green is a great grayish green. Notice how I'm bouncing around, working on the body a little bit, working on the wing a little bit. Back to the body, up to the head. Really trying to develop the bird as a whole. There's nothing wrong with entirely completing a section before moving on to another, but I like to bounce around. I like to see the whole piece develop. I feel like it gives the artwork some oneness, some cohesion. All right, this is the cerulean blue, adding a little bit of cerulean blue over the shadow. A lot of times we do see cool shadows, and I think that'll add a little bit of color to our bird. Black's not the only choice for darkening an area. You can use other darker colors, blues and purples. The feathers are very distinct in places, and so you can use a sharp pencil to make some individual thin lines to further develop the texture in the pattern of the bird's feathers. Right now I'm burnishing a little bit with a colorless blender. That's a pencil I didn't mention before and isn't entirely necessary, but it is a pencil without any color to it. It just adds more wax on the surface. Sometimes it smooths light speckly applications. Back to the black, very light pressure, just trying to create a smooth transition. And I felt like the beak wasn't blue enough. So I've gone ahead and added some cerulean over the cloud blue in the top half of the beak, just to brighten it up a little bit, just to make the blue more prominent. Almost forgot the other wing. We barely see it poking out from the left side of the body, but it's important. It gives our bird some depth, a forward wing, a wing in the background. Since we don't have a defined background, that little bit of wing on the other side of our bird does contribute to depth and dimension in our composition. All right, really adding pressure now, finding the darkest values. This is the third pass over some of these darker areas in the wing. And with light pressure, we're just going to bring the darkness and the intensity of the wing down just a little bit over the entire pattern of the feathers of the wing. A little bit of contrast right there on the left edge of the body where it meets the wing. So I've pumped up the whites and added a little bit of darkness right up against those whites. And there it is. There's our bird without a background. Now, I do have some colors selected for the background. The background in the reference is blurry, and I'm going to keep that going in our artwork. In the background, we'll use jade green, spring green, olive green, chartreuse, true green, black, and some vermilion. Now, you may notice the image is just a little bit blurry. I'll have to apologize here. My camera was slightly out of focus, but that's not so important for at least the beginning of our background. And you can see that I'm working passages of light and dark through the background that don't entirely align with the reference. I don't want the reference to look as much like a photograph. So I'm taking out the sort of the circular patterns that we see, what apparently are like transparent circular patterns from the lens. I'm taking that out of the background and just keeping the areas of light and dark generally in the same place as we see in the reference, but just a little bit softer around the edges of those circular patterns. Building up combinations of these pencils that were mentioned slowly and sort of fading them in and out of one another. There we are. The bird really pops from the soft background. The sharpness of the bird stands out from the softness of the background. Now we're not going to stop here. We're going to go ahead and introduce a few other media to our process. We're going to start with some gouache. It's also called opaque watercolor, and we have red, white, yellow, and green. And I'm going to use a pretty small brush. Brushes are not uniform in their size delineation from brand to brand, but this is a 0 for what it's worth, but it's kind of a longer bristled, fine point brush. Gouache dries to a matte finish, and you can often use it over a colored pencil for strong marks of color or bright highlights. And I'm going to mix up a pink using the red and the white and just hit a few of those feathers in the head so that they're clear and strong in terms of their color. This isn't a painting. I'm not trying to cover my work. I'm just trying to put a few accents in. And I'll do the same thing in a few areas that are the brightest whites in our composition. So a little bit of that around the eye and also on the wing close to where it meets the body. Same thing in the green feathers on the lighter half of our bird's body, the left half. I want to go ahead and put in some really strong, thin marks of yellow-green, just to further indicate the variety of texture. Texture is made from light and dark marks close together, and so we're still adding in light marks, even a few little tiny white feathers that were so small we really couldn't hang on to them with the colored pencil. The back and forth motion of the colored pencil to apply it to the paper sometimes would destroy these really small white marks. So I'm finding those with a brush. Same thing for those bright feathers, those whiter feathers where they're really catching the light in the bird's head. I'm going to go ahead and hit those with the paint as well over the white colored pencil so that it's as bright as it can be. All right, we've got a lot of contrast in our bird now. Now, I'm going to use a bridge here. You don't have to do that, but it's a way to keep your hand off the page. It's a clear acrylic bridge, and it allows me to carefully float my hand over my composition without touching it because I do have wet marks on there right now. And I'm going to pump up the white along the leading edge of our bird's forward wing. A bridge is a very handy tool. You can make one by taping a couple of erasers to the bottom of a ruler. You can't see through a homemade bridge like that, but it serves the same purpose. Just the last marks with the paint. Just a couple of super bright, thin feathers right where the light meets the dark. And I think we'll be ready to introduce our final medium. Mentioned before in this video, I'm using Molotow pens. They're permanent drawing pens, and I've got a really small one right now. I'm just going to lay in some tiny pen marks through some of these lighter feathers, these green and super light gray feathers in the lighter half of the body, the left half of the body, just to add to the texture of our bird. These marks are too small to do with a sharpened black colored pencil. And the application of colored pencil isn't so solid that the ink won't grab some of the paper and stay in place. All right, that's it. It's time to remove the tape. You want to pull the tape low and away. I'm getting a little bit of tearing, but this is Canson Meton's paper. It's pretty thick, and so just a little bit of tearing really won't hurt. It's not going to go all the way through the page, and I plan to mat this picture anyway. So the border will be covered with a mat. All right, well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the process of making this drawing of a hummingbird, and if you did follow along, I hope that you're proud of your drawing. I'm proud of mine. Do me a favor and press the like button so that more people are able to find this video tutorial, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Until next time, just remember, art makes the world go round.